Hi, I'm Tony Northrup for Train Signal, and welcome to the first lesson for the video training series covering the Microsoft 70-687 certification exam. This first lesson covers the first objective: evaluate hardware readiness and compatibility. So let's get started. This objective has four different sub-objectives. The first is 32-bit versus 64-bit. These are memory bus bandwidths. It's really important, so we'll talk about the significance of that. The next is screen resolution, which is how many little dots make up the horizontal and vertical lines on your monitor. The third is choose between an upgrade or a clean install. Again, this says choose, so we're not yet performing the upgrade or the clean install, but we're thinking about the right way to do it. And last is determine which SKU to install. SKU, I don't know why they use this term in the official objectives, but it just means which version of Windows 8 to install. So 32-bit versus 64-bit. Not everybody knows what this means. Your computer thinks in bits, which are ones and zeros. And of course, your computer thinks in far more than just 32 or 64 bits. But when you talk about 32-bit or 64-bit, you're talking about the width of the memory addresses. So 32 zeros or ones can all add up to be one very big number. Let's pop on over to Windows 8 and do some calculations. I'll just open up calculator here, and we'll do an exponent to 32. And you can see the answer is something over 4 billion. That's a lot of digits there after that 4. That means that your 32-bit operating system and your 32-bit PC can address 4 billion different locations in memory. So each one of these locations could have basically 8 bits of information. So if you type the number 5, that would get written into memory somewhere, and it would take up 8 bits. Every letter in a book, every pixel in a photo, every number that you type into a calculator needs its own special address. And 4 billion is a lot. It's more than enough to browse the web and use word processing apps, do just about anything you want to do. But it's not enough for everything. If you're doing video processing, if you're running a database server, you can easily go way past needing 4 billion bytes of information. And your computer has some virtual memory that it can swap in and out. But even your virtual memory has to be addressable within this address space. So let's figure out how many bytes of memory a computer with 64 bits can process. So that's 2 to the 64th power. And you can see that's a lot more. Add the commas in there to make it a little bit easier to read. So 64-bit bus is twice as wide as a 32-bit bus, but you can see it handles far more than twice the amount of information. Now, the early versions of DOS and Windows were 8 bits or even 16 bits. 32-bit architecture has been around since 1978. Microsoft's been trying to move away from it, starting with about Windows 95. It's getting a little bit old, but it's still actually really common, and lots of computers nowadays do everything they need to do with just 32 bits. But 64 bits is the way to go whenever you can. Now, the biggest difference you'll notice is application compatibility. 32-bit versions of Windows can only run 32-bit apps. If you happen to install the 64-bit version of Windows, you can still run 32-bit apps. You can also run 64-bit apps, which can take advantage of all that extra memory that it can address. Now, the different versions of Windows are also compatible with different computer hardware. It's really hard to get a PC nowadays that can't run 64-bit Windows. Just about every piece of computer equipment you buy new is going to be 64-bit. If you have older PC equipment, sometimes it won't run 64-bit and it will be 32-bit only. So if you have a 32-bit processor in your computer, you have to run the 32-bit version of Windows. But for the most part, all new computers can run 64-bit Windows, and they should, unless you're restricted in one of the ways that we'll discuss in the upcoming slides. This slide shows you the minimum and maximum memory amounts for 32 and 64-bit versions of Windows. Now, if you're running 32-bit Windows 8, you can install it on a PC that has just 1 gigabyte of RAM. That's really nice if you have an older PC or if you have like an ultra mobile tablet that's really lightweight and doesn't have much memory. 64-bit versions of Windows, however, require 2 gigabytes of memory. So Think about this. If you have a PC that has a 64-bit processor, but only 1 gig of RAM, you need to install the 32-bit version of Windows 8. You need both a 64-bit processor and 2 gigs of RAM to even install the 64-bit. But you know what? If you only had 1 or 2 gigs of RAM, it doesn't matter much anyway. You might as well install the 32-bit. You're not losing anything. Now, the maximum memory is where the 64-bit really shows its benefits. As I was saying, 32-bit can only address about 4 billion bytes of information, which means it's limited to about 4 gigabytes. 64-bit, on the other hand, can address about 2,000 gigabytes of RAM. My computers have like 8 or 12 gigs. That's way less than 2,000 gigs, and I think 64 bits is going to do us fine for a long time. Many famous people have been quoted as saying they won't need more than 64K of RAM. I can't imagine ever needing more than 2,000 gigabytes of RAM. That's 2 terabytes of RAM, but we'll see. Another one of the important differences between 32-bit and 64-bit versions of Windows is driver signing. So drivers are these pieces of software that interface between your computer's hardware and Windows 8. I'll switch back to Windows 8 and we can take a look at some drivers. I'm going to launch the device management console. And you can see nested in each of these is a list of different drivers. So you can see this virtual machine here has a driver for the video adapter called the VirtualBox Graphics Adapter for Windows 8. And if you click the driver tab here, we can see that Oracle has created the driver. We can see the date and the version. We'll cover drivers in more detail later, but what you should understand now is that each one of these drivers has to be signed if you're installing it on a 64-bit version of Windows. Now, when I say signed, I mean that a trusted developer, either Microsoft or a third-party developer who has a certificate from a trusted certification authority, needs to add their own digital signature to the driver file. Here's the reason digital signatures are good to have. The driver can do anything on the computer. Anything. It runs as part of what they call the kernel at ring 0 in the processor, which means it can access memory for different apps, it can save stuff to your disk, it can mess with your hardware. That means that if a driver has some malware in it, if a hacker installs a new driver on your computer, they can do anything. They can install rootkits, they can monitor all your private activities. That's not true for most apps. If you run an app that happens to be malicious, Windows is going to keep it reined in, but not so with drivers. They run without any limitations. And for that reason, it's really important that you not install a bad driver on your computer. And 64-bit Windows requires drivers to be signed. You cannot install a driver that isn't signed unless you start Windows in the special Disabled Driver Signature Enforcement mode. Otherwise, you basically need to be a developer. This can be convenient sometimes. Sometimes there'll be a new driver that solves a problem for your brand new video card, and the developer hasn't had a chance to get it signed yet because that can take weeks to do. So they'll just put it on their website, and if you have a 32-bit version of Windows, you can pull it down and install it right away, and it'll get your hardware up and running. The trade-off for being able to do that is that it might have some malware on it, or you might accidentally install some software that installs a new driver that has malware on it. So it's a security risk. By requiring driver signing in 64-bit Windows, Microsoft is saying in the future, all drivers are going to have to be signed. And indeed, when you look at things like Windows RT, all drivers have to be signed. So that's definitely the future. There are some upgrade restrictions. If you are currently running, let's say Windows 7 or Windows Vista, the 32-bit version of it, you have to upgrade to the 32-bit version of Windows. If you're running 64-bit Windows Vista, Windows 7, you can only upgrade to the 64-bit version of Windows. If you want to go from 32-bit to 64-bit, maybe you're adding more memory and you want to go past that 4 gigabyte limit, you need to do a clean install. And we will discuss how to do that in the upcoming objectives. So let's take a look at how to figure out which version of Windows you're running. In Windows 8, we're going to go to Start Screen and then search the settings for System. And on this screen, we'll look for the system type. We can see we have a 64-bit processor. It says x64 based processor here, and we're running the 64-bit operating system. You can see this particular computer has the very minimum amount of memory used here. Now, I will point out something interesting. If you're running a 32-bit version of Windows, you can have 4 gigabytes of memory installed in your 32-bit PC with 32-bit Windows, but Windows might not be able to address it all. Now, when I talked about 32 bits only being able to address roughly 4 billion bytes of information, that is absolute. It really can't go past that. And the system RAM is not the only address space that Windows needs to be able to communicate with. For example, you also have your video card. Video cards sometimes have a whole gigabyte of RAM. So the usable memory that Windows can access is the maximum amount, which is 4 gigs in 32-bit Windows, minus any memory consumed by other things, mostly the memory card. So a computer with 512 megs of video memory is only going to have 3.5 gigs of memory available to the system. A computer with 1 gigabyte of memory is only going to have 3 gigs available to the system. So that 4 gigs can actually shrink down more and more. Moving on to the next objective, screen resolution, we need to talk about the minimum and maximum amounts allowed in Windows. In Windows 8 here, I will open up the screen resolution dialog box. There are different ways to get to it, but I always just right-click the desktop and then click screen resolution. And you can see that this computer is configured at 1024 by 768. That's not actually the minimum here. Now, Windows 8 won't allow you to go lower, but if you have a computer that has an 800 by 600 pixel monitor, you can install Windows 8. There are a couple of catches to it though. You won't be able to run any apps designed for Windows 8, which Microsoft sometimes calls the Windows Store apps, or sometimes they used to call them Metro apps. You can still run your desktop apps on a computer with an 800 by 600 resolution screen. So basically, if you have XP or Vista or Windows 7 installed on a computer with an 800 by 600 resolution monitor, you can install Windows 8 on it, and it should work just like it works now. You can still run your desktop apps. You'll have your start screen instead of a start menu, but you won't be able to run those new Windows Store apps. If you want to run Windows Store apps, which most people will, you'll need to be at least 1024 by 768. So you can see that's the bare minimum that this computer supports. I will quickly open up a Windows Store app just so you can see that it works here. All right, so you can see this is the immersive Windows Store app. It takes up the entire screen. There's no borders or Chrome or buttons at the top. There's no menus. It is a full screen app. Switching back to the desktop, there's one other resolution restriction that you need to memorize for this test, and it's not an option available here, but I'll write it down. It is 1366 by 768. That's an important resolution to memorize. Now, you can see the vertical width, 768, is the same that this screen has. And that's a really common minimum requirement. Lots of mobile computers have this particular resolution. The width is a little bit different here. 1366 is wider than the 1024 by 768 that's been common. It's a widescreen format. So that's the format that you'd use to watch, say, HD TV probably. It's important to memorize this number because that's the resolution that you need if you want to run Windows 8 apps side by side. So you can take a Windows 8 app and snap it to the side of the screen and see it alongside another app running in the main window. Here's a good way to remember it. Windows 8 apps require a screen of 1024 by 768. Windows 8 apps can run in that. So why do you need the extra pixels here? Quickly do some math. 1366 by 1024 means we have 342 pixels left over. Those 342 horizontal pixels are dedicated to the app that you can stick to the side of the screen. So when you slide an app over to the side, it's going to be about 340 pixels wide. And that leaves the remaining 1024 pixels for an app to continue running as if there weren't another app over there. So 1366 by 768 is the minimum resolution needed to multitask in Windows 8. Moving on to the next sub-objective, let's talk about doing an upgrade versus a clean install. An upgrade is when you have a version of Windows running on a PC and you stick the Windows 8 DVD into the computer, or maybe you download it online, and you run the upgrade while the old version of Windows is running. You can only run an upgrade when Windows is running. So if you have, say, a Windows 7 PC and Windows isn't starting for some reason, don't think you can do an upgrade from it. You need to get Windows running before you can do an upgrade. You can't have an old install on there that doesn't start up because you messed up the boot files or something like that. Start your old version of Windows, insert the Windows 8 media, and launch setup, and you will be performing an in-place upgrade. An in-place upgrade will grab the user files and settings and apps and transport them into the new version of Windows. What Windows 8 actually does is it takes your settings and files and everything and puts them into a special part of the disk. Then it does a clean install. After the install is done, it re-imports all your settings and files, so it's pretty smart that way. Now, a clean install is different. It erases everything on the PC, including any malware except perhaps for rootkits. Now, you can do a clean install on any PC. You don't need an existing operating system on there. It will work even if your old version of Windows isn't running properly. So this is an important decision that you have to make on a regular basis in an IT job. Do you upgrade the existing computer, or do you perform a clean install? I like to do clean install as often as possible because, it gets rid of all the junk, any malware that might be on there, cleans up, the registry and all files you're not using. But the upgrade certainly is more convenient, especially if you have all these apps that you're using and you still need. Let's talk about some of the restrictions for upgrading from different versions of Windows. If you want to upgrade from Windows XP to Windows 8, you need to have Windows XP Service Pack 3. If you do an in-place upgrade from Windows XP, Windows 8 can copy the files over to Windows 8. So all the files in your documents and your music and your pictures, those will still appear in Windows 8. That's it. All your apps are gone, your pretty desktop picture and all your custom colors, those don't get transferred. So if you upgrade from XP to Windows 8, memorize this, you only get to keep your files. Also remember, if you upgrade, you need to have Service Pack 3 installed on Windows XP. If you want to upgrade from Windows Vista, you have a lot more flexibility. You can, of course, transfer your files. You can also transfer your settings and apps. So if you have all your different apps installed, you won't have to reinstall them after you upgrade. If you want to upgrade from Windows Vista, you need to have Vista Service Pack 1 or later installed. But if you didn't have Service Pack 1 installed, where were you? Because that's important. You probably got your computer hacked a long time ago, and you're probably better off doing a clean install anyway. Now, if you want to upgrade from Windows 7, you don't need a service pack at all, and optionally you can keep your files, settings, and apps. Setup will prompt you to determine which of those you want to keep. Now, before we go on to the next sub-objective, let's define a term, and that's SKU. You'll hear this in just a general vernacular, but SKU is a stock keeping unit, and here it just means a version of Windows 8. Windows 8 has 4 SKUs, and I'll discuss Windows RT first. Windows RT is designed specifically for computers that have what they call an ARM processor, ARM. That's a mobile processor that's a different processor than the typical Intel processors our PCs have been running on for years. ARM processors are usually used for these mobile phones and tablets that you're familiar with, so they're designed for mobile devices. They're really energy efficient and they allow computers to be really small. So Windows RT is a version of Windows 8 designed specifically for these mobile devices, and it's really different from the other ones. You can't install Windows RT on your Intel-based computer or your AMD computer or anything that was running any other version of Windows. And you can't install any other operating system on a Windows RT device. They're proprietary. You're locked into Windows RT when you get Windows RT. So Windows RT and the other versions of Windows, their paths never cross. Windows 8 is the basic version of Windows. It would basically be like Windows 7 Home Editions or Windows Vista Home, and it has just about everything you need, but it doesn't have some of the more advanced features, and we'll cover the specific features in a little bit. Windows 8 Pro is sort of like Windows Vista Ultimate or Windows 7 Ultimate. They intend it for consumers or small businesses, and they basically give you everything that you might want. Windows 8 Enterprise is the business version of Windows 8, and you can only use it if you have a special agreement with Microsoft. and you're using an Active Directory domain environment. Basically, it's only available to software assurance customers and then TechNet and MSDN subscribers. And then it's not even all TechNet subscribers. You have to have a higher level TechNet subscription if you want to get Windows 8 Enterprise. So whenever you're going to install Windows 8, you kind of have to pick from these 4 different versions, but it's easier than you might think. If you have an ARM device, you have to use Windows RT, and you know what? It's already going to be installed in there, so you don't have to think about it. If you're installing a computer at home and they're not a power user, Windows 8 is probably fine. Windows 8 Enterprise is the business version of Windows 8, and you can only use it if you have a special agreement with Microsoft. This includes mostly enterprise software assurance customers, but you can also get Windows 8 Enterprise through TechNet, MSDN, Windows Intune, and possibly other channels. But basically, it's not available to the average user, nor would you really want it. For the average user, Windows 8 Pro is a better option. So let's talk about the features that are present in Windows 8 Pro, but not present in Windows 8. So in those cases where you have to decide between the base version of Windows 8 or the more advanced version, you can decide whether it's worth the extra few dollars. Windows 8 Pro has the remote desktop server, which allows you to connect to a remote PC and control the whole desktop. And I love remote desktop. I use it on my desktop PC all the time. So what I'll do is I'll grab my laptop or my tablet computer and I'll be in the living room and I'll connect to the desktop in my office. And it's just like you're sitting right there. It works great. It's totally worth the money. Encrypting file system encrypts individual files and basically only protects those files from other users that might be logged onto your computer. Anyway, it's a form of cryptography and it's really useful. I don't think it's quite as useful as the next feature, which is BitLocker. BitLocker encrypts entire drives. Your system drive, your data drives, your backup drives, USB flash drives. BitLocker encrypts the whole thing. That way, you know, when you're at the airport and you throw your laptop in that box that goes through security, if you forget it or somebody else grabs it, they can't get your data. As long as you have your computer configured to lock and you have BitLocker set up to prompt you for passwords. We'll go into more detail on BitLocker in later objectives, but it's an important feature if you're security conscious, and if you're security conscious, you're going to want to get Windows 8 Pro instead of standard Windows 8. Hyper-V, I am not a fan of. We're going to be covering it later. It's a virtualization technology. It's not the best out there. There are free Windows virtualization technologies better than Hyper-V, but it's one of the features in Windows 8 Pro. Virtual hard disk booting allows Windows 8 to be installed on a file on your computer, which provides some flexibility in IT environments where you might be booting between multiple different computers. There's no real reason the average consumer would ever want to use it, but in an IT environment, it can be really important. Windows 8 Pro can join an Active Directory domain. And if you're not familiar with an Active Directory, it's a structure that businesses use. They set up some servers and they have all their computers join this domain, and it makes it much easier to manage. Basically, if you're a business and you have more than half a dozen different client computers, you're going to want to set up an Active Directory domain, which means you're going to want to use Windows 8 Pro computers. Windows 8 Pro also allows you to download Windows Media Center. It's not included with Windows 8. But you can download it, and there are some restrictions. It's usually free. Sometimes you might have to pay, but Windows Media Center includes the ability to play DVDs and record TV. It's not something most people in business environments would ever need. Now let's talk about Windows 8 Enterprise. Enterprise includes all the stuff that Pro has, and some extra stuff. It has App Locker, which enterprises can use to restrict the apps that computers can run. Basically, with App Locker, you can tell computers to only run the apps that you specify, or only run apps that are developed by your internal company, or to specifically not run some apps that you just don't like. Windows to Go is really cool, and we're going to be covering it in the next objective. With Windows to Go, you can install Windows 8 to a flash drive, then stick that flash drive in just about any PC and reboot it from the flash drive, and it gets your corporate image of Windows on a computer, and you can carry it around in your pocket. Direct access is a virtual private networking technology. It's a VPN technology, but it happens completely automatically. And it connects a PC with an internet connection back to the corporate network seamlessly without the user doing anything. So imagine an employee has a laptop and they're out traveling. They can stop into any coffee shop and get an internet access. And then as soon as they're connected to the internet, they'll instantly have access to all that private stuff on your internal network. Their email and file servers and stuff that's not accessible from the internet. Direct access tunnels them into your network and does it completely automatically. So with Windows 7 and earlier versions of Windows, you had to set up a VPN connection. And that meant every employee had to be trained on how to use the VPN. When they connected to the coffee shop, they'd have to think, okay, now I need to fire up the VPN so I can get to these internal files. And so they had to walk through a couple of steps. And you know what happened is people were just like, forget it, I won't bother checking my email, it's too much trouble. With direct access, they just connect to the internet. If they have a broadband wireless card, they'll stay connected all the time. And they don't have to think about it, they get their files, they get their email. Branch cache is this not really widely used technology, but it's intended to speed up access at remote offices. So if you're a company and you have a big headquarters and then you have different branch offices around the country or around the world, it can make accessing files a little bit easier, but really it's not very commonly used. Remote FX virtualization helps to virtualize apps. So you could, if you have what they call thin clients, PCs that don't have a lot of processing power, you can install apps that require a lot of processing power, let's say Photoshop or video editing apps, and virtualize them. So you can put those on one really powerful server and then let your clients virtualize the app. And it's like they have all that processing power in their thin client. It saves you some money because you don't have to build out these really big desktops for every user. You set up one big server and then you virtualize the apps and you can spread it around on their little computers. Network file system, NFS, is this Unix way of sharing files, and it's super old and it's not very common anymore, but there are some companies out there that have old NFS file servers and they need their clients to connect to it. So if that's the case, they're going to need Windows 8 Enterprise. Now, the one feature that Enterprise does not have that Pro has is Media Center. So in other words, with Windows 8 Enterprise, you won't be able to play DVDs, and that is important in some enterprises. You'll need some third-party software. It doesn't come with Windows. So these are the upgrade paths from Windows 7. You can't upgrade from any version of Windows 7 to any version of Windows 8. It's kind of a pain that way. If you have Windows 7 Starter, Home Basic, or Home Premium, you can upgrade to Windows 8 or Windows 8 Pro. You can't upgrade to Windows 8 Enterprise. If you have Windows 7 Professional or Ultimate, you can upgrade only to Windows 8 Pro. You can't upgrade just to standard Windows 8, so you have to pay the extra for Windows 8 Pro. If you have Windows 7 Enterprise or Windows 7 Professional, you get the option to upgrade to Windows 8 Enterprise as well, but those are the only versions of Windows 7 that can upgrade to Windows 8 Enterprise. So if you have somebody who's running Windows 7 Ultimate and you want them to upgrade to Windows 8 Enterprise, guess what? You got to do a clean install and transfer over all their files manually and then reinstall all their apps. It's a little bit of a pain. And if you remember, Windows RT is its own thing. There's no crossover with the other versions of Windows, so you can't ever upgrade to Windows RT. You just got to buy a new ARM-based PC and it'll come with it. So that's pretty much what you need to know for this objective. This is Tony Northrop for Train Signal, and I hope you found the lesson both educational and enjoyable, and I'll see you next time.